your testimony, and we're going to open up the hearing on Assembly Bill 276, which provides certain protections and services for victims of human trafficking. Speaker Hambrick, welcome back. Mr. Dold, welcome back.
Thank you,
now,
Mr.
just
Chairman.
so you know, I'd like to try to end this hearing by 10 o'clock if possible, if we still have one additional bill to hear. Although, since we don't have floor, we can go a little beyond 11, but I'd like to try to wrap up the entire hearing by 11 if possible. Will 30 minutes give you enough time, Mr. Speaker, on this one?
Absolutely. Hopefully significantly less than that, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Go ahead.
For the record, and I did not do this in the first bill, and I apologize to the Secretary. My name is John Hambrick. I have the privilege of representing Assembly District 2. Mr. Chairman, the bill you have before you, Assembly Bill 276, hopefully should be very easy for you. This bill was before this committee last session. It received unanimous approval. The bill then went to the other house at the north end of this building, and it received unanimous consent, passed unanimously. The problem came in when it reached the floor. Then Senator Sigerbloom had a minor amendment, which I agreed to. It's very, very minor. It came on the floor at the last evening, just before sine die, for concurrence. The then Majority Leader William Horn killed the bill. And although it had unanimous consent from both houses, he killed the bill for some reasons that I should not go into it at this point. So this is an identical bill. It is not a human trafficking bill as such. It's an education bill. It will address and give benefit to school teachers, to counselors, and to nurses to get materials to help educate themselves and to recognize potential victims of trafficking in the schools. There is a provision about signage, which Mr. Breslow has some questions about, and we'll address that later on, should there be an amendment. So again, this bill is a pro-education and pro-benefit bill where the victims can go into, if they see law enforcement, if they see any counselors, if they wish to reach out to anyone in the public service area, they can get help and guidance. Basically, that's the crux to the bill. And Mr. Dolt is here, who is, again, the author of the bill, along with the Polaris Project from last session. And again, this is not truly a human trafficking, but more of an education bill that will go after human traffic victims in a most beneficial way. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Dold, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And again, James Dold, for the record, I'm testifying in my official capacity, or my individual capacity, I should say. I first thought I might just start off by telling you a little bit about my personal story and how I got involved in the issue of human trafficking. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Las Vegas, Nevada. And one of the reasons that this issue is so personal to me is that I was actually a victim of child sexual abuse and child labor exploitation. When I was 13 years old, I was in the Boy Scouts, and one of the parents of the other Boy Scouts began essentially grooming me and taking advantage of some of the insecurities that I had. And I grew up in the inner city, and I was the only one in my family to eventually graduate from high school. And, I grew up in a neighborhood that was unfortunately drug-infested, and there were a lot of bad things. And I was looking for, I think, love, and that love that I didn't think that I was getting from my family life. And this predator was there to prey on those insecurities. And in a place where I should have been safe, in the Boy Scouts and in a church, unfortunately I wasn't, and that's where my predator found me and eventually convinced me to run away from home, and I did. And for a little more than 2 years, I essentially lived in this house where I did everything from cooking to cleaning to being sexually abused. I was called a nigger so many times I couldn't even tell you. The emotional abuse that I suffered. And it was one of those things that, always stuck with me. And at that time, we didn't know about human trafficking. The federal human trafficking bill hadn't even passed yet. This is pre-2000. And luckily, I was able to escape that situation and eventually move back in with my parents. And thankfully, because of coaches and amazing teachers that I had, I played football at Valley High School, and I was very fortunate to have mentors that supported me and was able to put me on a path where I was able to do well. But of course, coming from that situation, you still you never fully get over it. You live with those scars, and it wasn't until I was much older that I realized what had happened to me. And, I came forward and I did actually contact Metro law enforcement, but unfortunately, at that time, the statute of limitations had run, which I also think is a really, and this isn't related to the bill, but I do think that's something that should be looked at, is extending the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse victims and child human trafficking victims, because I wasn't comfortable coming forward until I was nearly 28 years old. Especially being a man, it's a little bit different as well. That victimization, I was only starting to get more comfortable talking about that. And so for me, I struggled in school. And so parts of this bill are so amazing because, first and foremost, it provides teachers and students with information about human trafficking. Pimps and traffickers, people who exploit our children, the number one place that they recruit is right out of middle and high schools. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old girls and boys. They go on Facebook. They hang out at malls. Similar legislation has passed in states like Virginia and Maryland. Matter of fact, I heard recently several school students in Virginia came home and told their dad about how they got this sort of training and this materials were provided to them. Teachers were more able to spot the warning signs of trafficking, to get more involved, to alert school nurses and school psychologists, to get in contact with law enforcement. So that's an important component because that is the preventative side that really has never been addressed in the state of Nevada, preventing these terrible human rights abuse from happening in the first place. So that's one important component of the bill. The second component is the mandated posting of the NHTRC hotline, which is the national hotline that actually feeds tips to the FBI. It feeds tips to local law enforcement. They have done an amazing job working both at the state and federal level, helping to get victims out of human trafficking situations, as well as making sure that law enforcement has the necessary information that they need. To provide some numbers to this, in 2014, the NHTRC hotline fielded 5,000 cases of human trafficking from across the country. Nevada ranked 15th in those cases that were reported, with 110 calls coming directly into the national hotline. We can only imagine what those numbers would have been like if this sign would have been posted in these places that are highlighted. And the places that are highlighted are places where victims are most likely to come into contact with it. Places like sexually oriented businesses, schools, bus stops, truck stops, places where victims are more likely to frequent and where pimps are more likely to be. And so this is, in effect, a lifeline to human trafficking victims, right, to provide them with that hope to be able to escape. One of the other really important parts of this bill is providing victims with information regarding resources and making sure that if there are foreign national victims that have been brought into this country, and we have in this country right now about 100,000 U.S. children, U.S. citizen children, are victimized and exploited in prostitution every year. 100,000. That's according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I don't know if the Clark County Metro is going to be testifying, but I'm sure they'll tell you about their numbers. About 100 kids every year picked up on the Las Vegas Strip alone. Right? This is a huge problem. What I often talk about, and I love my state and I love my city where I grew up, but Las Vegas is, in many ways, the sex trafficking capital of the United States, right, for a whole host of reasons. There's a lot of international highways, right? In some ways, it's close to being a border state. Makes it easy to traffic people in and out of the state. Right, there's a connection right to L.A. Traffickers, they barely ever just stay in one city, so they'll move around. Right, individual pimps will take stables of young girls across the country. They'll go from San Francisco to L.A. to San Diego, back up 15, out to Las Vegas, and then onward. It's not uncommon for the FBI to break up rings that range not just from California, but all the way out to Georgia, all the way back up to D.C. And so, making sure that there's these hotlines that are available, so that when victims are able to come forward, or when community members are able to come forward and provide that information to the tip line, that information can be passed along to law enforcement. They can get the needed information to make sure that they crack down on this terrible scourge. So this bill is an amazing bill. These provisions have really been passed across the country. There are also provisions that are contained within the Uniform Law, the Uniform Human Trafficking Act. It's an act that I worked on right before I left Polaris. So these are things that have really been adopted and accepted nationwide, and with my personal story and with all the work. And again, Mr. Speaker, I just want to thank you for introducing this bill and really your leadership, because I think folks might know this, but you were the first person in Nevada to really bring this issue up and have been fighting since day one. And on behalf of myself and so many other children like me who never had that voice, I just want to thank you personally for that. So with that, I'll go ahead and close, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Old. Yeah, it's absolutely true that the Speaker's been a tireless advocate for this issue, trying to get this problem resolved as much as possible. Mr. Gardner has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is going to be in Section 1, Subsection 2, Part D, and then 1 and 2 of that. It's talking about, at the request of the victim, providing the victim with one or both of the following forms, and they're going to be issued. Either it's going to be the Declaration of Law Enforcement Officer for Victim of Trafficking in Persons, or the U Non-Immigrant Status Certification. I'm just wondering what exactly those do and why they're in this bill when it seems to be more of an education bill is what we've been talking about. So I'm just wondering why we're having them get these and what they do.
So specifically the I-914B forms are the certification forms that law enforcement use to give people who might have been brought here illegally by the traffickers temporary status to help them investigate the cases. Essentially, there's something created, the T visa in the Human Trafficking Act of 2000 that President Bush signed into law, that created this T visa to incentivize victims of human trafficking who are foreign national victims to cooperate with law enforcement here in the United States to be able to bust the traffickers, whether they were foreign nationals elsewhere that brought them in here, or whether or not they were traffickers right here in the United States. And so that's essentially what it is. It allows the victim to have some sort of temporary status, because if they have been brought here illegally, then they're still technically here illegally and subject to deportation. And so it's just a form that exists through the Department of Homeland Security that law enforcement can fill out to make sure that the person all their paperwork is essentially up to date.
Are there any further questions for the Speaker or Mr. Dole at this time? Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can we go to Section 5? I just want to talk about the posting, and thank you so much, Speaker, for bringing this forth, because it's interesting, because a few of the legislators, we have been actually honing in on this, so it's great that it's here. Just a question about the enforcement of this. Is this something that I'm assuming that, is it Department of Business and Industry will be responsible for enforcing this on all of these establishments?
So the sections that specify in subsection 3 there, Department of Transportation.
Mr. Dole, go ahead and
I'm sorry,
state your
Mr.
name
Dole.
again for the record.
Mr. Dole, James Dole for the record. So here in section 3 on that same page, Department of Transportation, the Department of Business and Industry should develop the sign. And so I think that the thought is that that's where the enforcement mechanism will come in. And again, it's just a basic civil penalty. It's not meant to, we don't want to overburden any sort of businesses or anything like that. But we want to make sure that the signs are posted. Certainly for the Department of Transportations in city-run bus stops, that's something that the department specifically can do themselves. And so, but the enforcement mechanisms for the private enterprises, that was meant to be in there to make sure that they are complying with the sign requirement.
And as a quick follow-up, so have you, with all these industries and businesses that are listed, have you had a chance to kind of get an idea of, support of it and compliance?
Senator Thompson, if you don't mind, I'll take that. The answer is yes and no.
Mr. Speaker, identify yourself
okay,
again, please.
Senator John Hambrick. Thank you, Senator Thompson. The Nevada Trucking Association is very active, and they are posting this. You may have seen signs and handouts. Their drivers have signs on their windows, and it's very, very active. Senator Jones he just held up, so they are out there. And the truckers in this state and interstate truckers are putting these on their windows as they go into the truck stops. So the Trucking Association is very, very active. The petroleum industry who run the truck stops are very, very active in this area. Mr. Bruslow is in the audience, I believe, and he has some minor concerns about the signs, and rather than he may talk, if he has time, perhaps would like to have the Secretary of State. I'm going to stay out of that battle. That's an intra-department area. But so the signs are being used, and in Colorado, they're very, very effective in the truck stops. And we had a push a couple of years ago at the truck stops going across the northern part of the state and I-15 and two trucks, commercial truck stops. And the trucking industry is very, very supportive, and it's having effect. And where these victims, when they walk through, see these things and they go to truck drivers, I need help, I have to get out. And local authorities are called very quickly. So it is beneficial and it has helped.
All right, Mr. Jones.
Yeah, just for clarification, and either of you can answer this. I look up human trafficking, and when I first started, I was a little confused because I was thinking of like the movie Taken, you know, where the girl gets taken and actually put someplace. But human trafficking is basically when a person takes a minor and then keeps them, for lack of a better term, imprisoned or believing they have to stay, and then utilizes their services or coerces them to do prostitution. But also in the bill, it talks about older persons being human traffickers. So how's that reconcile?
So the basic definition of human trafficking, I'm sorry, I should have started off with that, but...
Your name, Mr. Dole?
James Dole, for the record, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. But the basic definition is any time that the use of force, fraud, or coercion is used to compel somebody to engage in labor or services or commercial sex, or when a child is induced to engage in a commercial sex act. So there's no requirement of force, fraud, or coercion. The mere inducement of a child to engage in commercial sex is, in fact, enough to be convicted of human trafficking under federal and state law now. And that's universally the accepted definitions. I think here it was trying to make sure that the most vulnerable people, both the children and the elderly adults who might be trafficked and exploited, make sure that they are provided with the proper resources and that the proper authorities are notified so that people are in the loop that, look, we've got a very elderly person who's been being exploited either in labor or potentially commercial sex, and that they have certain rights and that they're taken care of, and so that they're just not left on their own. And so that was a real big thing, because we at the far end of the spectrums, there are very vulnerable people. You have the kids, and you've got the elderly, and we want to make sure that they have especially are taken care of.
Okay, Mr. Dole, Speaker Hamrick, thank you very much for your testimony this morning. I will now open it up to anybody that would like to testify in favor of Assembly Bill 276. I have 3 seats here in the north and 2 in the south. I'd like all 5 of them occupied at this time, and we will go first to the north, and we'll come down to the south. Mr. Kent, good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, Brett Kent, Special Assistant Attorney General. On behalf of Attorney General Adam Laxalt, here to express our strong support for AB 276. During the first week of the session, I had the privilege of giving you some history and an overview of our efforts to combat trafficking in our state. I'm certainly not going to repeat all that now, but I had pointed out that there are 4 components to our efforts to combat trafficking in our state: prevention and awareness, investigation and prosecution, treatments and services for victims, and then developing some reliable data on the extent of the problem. And AB 276 focuses on 2 of those components: the prevention awareness piece and the treatment and services for victims piece. And for this reason, we support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Don't leave just in case there are any questions. Mr. Jones?
Thank you, Chairman Hansen, members of the committee. My name is John Jones, and I'm here on behalf of the Nevada District Attorneys Association, and we are also here in support of AB 276. We would like to thank the Speaker. Over the years, he has been a leader in this issue, and we've had numerous meetings in our office with Speaker Hambrick where he's encouraged law enforcement to be creative with respect to human trafficking. I will say, with respect to letting victims know, specifically in Clark County with juveniles, we do have a system where we try to link victims of sex trafficking to services. So we do appreciate this bill and are here in support.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Enos, first time in our committee, I think.
First time in Judiciary. For the record, Paul Enos, CEO of the Nevada Trucking Association. And we're here to testify today in favor of Assembly Bill 276, and would also like to thank the Speaker for being a leader on this issue. Back in 2012, we recognized that this was an issue that really did impact the image of the trucking industry. And unfortunately, a lot of this activity happens at rest stops. It happens at truck stops. Our drivers are being solicited. And when you walk through a truck stop, sometimes you see a little sticker on the window with a lizard and a red band sign through it. No lot lizards. Well, what does that mean? Well, a lot lizard is a derogatory term for a prostitute who works at a truck stop. And, I've seen those all my life. And
Prostitutes or stickers?
the stickers.
Good, very
The stickers.
good. Want to make sure the record's clear on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Although I'm not sure it would hurt my reputation either way. And it really wasn't until in 2012 when we were contacted by the group called Truckers Against Trafficking, asking us to get involved in Nevada, where we realized these weren't people that were working these truck stops of their own volition. A lot of these people had been kidnapped. They had been put into servitude. They were victims. And that we really had a role as an industry to educate our truck drivers to not just ignore the problem, when you're solicited on a CB or you hear that knock on the cab, but to take action. And one of the things that Truckers Against Trafficking does is they produce these little wallet cards that we give to all our drivers. And in fact, we've sent these out. We've sent out a little 28-minute DVD that we have, and we're actually changing it up to educate our drivers. We tell our companies, when you hire somebody at your safety meeting, show your guys these videos so they can recognize what the signs are of somebody being trafficked. And one of the things I tell them is it's okay to be wrong. It is okay to be wrong. If you have that suspicion, call 911 and then call the hotline. And we ask them to call 911 because really we think law enforcement being able to have that direct connection, that quick connection, we can rescue some of these young girls and also boys from these awful, awful situations. We do think that the truckers are the eyes and ears of the road, and we have had some incidents. In fact, just last month in Virginia, we had a truck driver recognize a victim of sex trafficking, and they were able to rescue a young girl from her pimp. Unfortunately, this does happen at truck stops. We do have a lot of our members put these stickers on their windows with the hotline number, the Truckers Against Trafficking hotline number. We have our truck stops hang the posters up in their facilities, and then also pass these wallet cards out to make this issue more in the forefront and one that's more difficult for us to ignore. So we do appreciate the industry doing this. We appreciate this bill, and we also appreciate law enforcement. I sat down this summer with Chief Osborne at the High Patrol, and you look at their strategic plan for the next 3 years. One of the issues that they're addressing is human trafficking and working with the other law enforcement agencies. We've worked with almost every law enforcement agency in the state of Nevada on this issue, talking about it, creating awareness within our industry. And I think this bill, giving our law enforcement partners the training to identify these folks, and then also making it more aware at the places where these people are trafficked is a good thing.
Thank you very much, Ms. Enos. We do have some questions for you three before we go down south. Mr. Anderson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Enos, I just wanted to say I think this is a really neat program. Just wanted to say thank you for being involved with this.
Thank you.
Mr. Jones?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Can or Mr. Jones, good last name. The fourth pillar you mentioned was the getting stats or the numbers. Can you give us an idea? Because the testimony, I've heard it a few times that like Las Vegas is one of the capitals for human trafficking. So do you have any stats on like how many young women have been, or males, young victims have been recovered, so to speak, and then how many pimps have been prosecuted under these human trafficking laws in our state? It's like in order, kind of. So we know how big the problem is in terms of numbers.
Assemblyman Jones, thank you for the question. John Jones on behalf of the Nevada District Attorneys Association. That's a great question, and I'm looking at the monitor, and I see Esther Brown down in Clark County. As she, I don't know if she still is, but she used to be a coordinator for victims of sex trafficking down in Clark County, and I think she would be a great person to direct that question to.
Okay, well, thank you three for your testimony this morning. We will go down south. Actually, we'll start with Senator Kerr, and then we'll go to Ms. Brown, who can hopefully answer the question of Assemblyman Jones. Good morning, Senator.
Good morning. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and thank you. My name is Terry Kerr. I'm appearing in my personal capacity. I am a what's known as a Uniform Law Commissioner and have been since 1999. Many of the committee members here have heard me testify on so-called uniform acts. In fact, we've got one coming up, AB 420, later this morning. Let me just take a minute to talk about what the organization is and how that relates to human trafficking. Mr. Dold actually made reference to a uniform act. The Uniform Law Commission is made up of about 350 members. They're all attorneys. They are judges, federal and state, trial and appellate court, law school professors, several dozen legislators, as a matter of fact, representatives from the various attorneys' general offices. We meet once a year, every summer, but we have ongoing committee meetings to try to identify issues that we believe are emerging and should be codified in the various states as state law. We believe in federalism. And it's a process that might take 2-3 years to come up with an act. And normally we deal with the world of commerce. And what we try to have is unanimity between the states where the rules are the same no matter what jurisdiction you happen to be in. It's rare for us to get involved in the world of, I'll just call it criminal law, but we identified human trafficking as something so significant, and human traffickers do cross state lines, of course, that we thought we ought to get involved in it. So in 2013, the Uniform Law Commission adopted the Uniform Act. It's actually called the Uniform Act for the Prevention of and Remedies for Human Trafficking, and it's on the agenda, I believe, Mr. Chairman, for next Wednesday as AB 354 before this committee. I won't go into the act itself. I just want to, the reason I'm here is that when we did when our committee did its research, it came up with the same numbers that Mr. Dold made reference to, the 100,000 U.S. children each year being brought into prostitution. The statistics we came up with was that worldwide there's maybe 27 million people a year who become victims of human trafficking. In this country, it's about 80% involving prostitution. The other 20% forced labor to some degree. And of course, what happens is that many of these victims later themselves are coerced in becoming recruiters and traffickers and enforcers themselves. The purpose for me here today, Mr. Chairman, is to let you know that the Uniform Law Commission, even though it has its own standalone act, is in support of this bill because the sections 1, 2, and 5, the Uniform Act has very similar concepts, not word for word the same, but the concepts are there. So I wanted this morning to tee up the committee for the hearing next Wednesday, but also to let you know that the Uniform Law Commission stands in support of the bill that the Speaker has brought forth this morning. And I'm also going to compliment, as others have done, the work that Speaker Hambrick has done on this subject. I remember when he arrived in Carson City in 2009, he had a couple of bills then dealing with asset forfeiture and soliciting minors. He's had subsequent bills, of course, and we've come a long way in this state largely because of the efforts of Speaker Hambrick. So that's pretty much my testimony, Mr. Chairman. I'll answer questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to be talking to you very soon on the other bill. Seeing no questions, we'll go to Ms. Brown.
Good morning. My name is Esther Rodriguez Brown, and I'm the founder of the Embracing Project. And to answer John's question, no, I'm not the sexually exploited youth court administrator anymore, but I'm still working with the youth. Last year, according to data that Dr. Kennedy collected through juvenile court, we have 202 victims, minor victims. From those 202, one was a male. Of those 202, I serve 189, and I'm here on behalf of all those that I serve and that I don't serve because we don't know where they are. I support this bill, and I'm thankful for Mr. Hambrick, too, Assemblyman Hambrick, for all the hard work that he has been doing with this population. I support every aspect of the bill, including putting the number in the business, because I was talking to a colleague of mine when James was testifying, and since the time that I've been here for this bill and the previous bill, I had already 2 text messages of 2 girls that they are trying to get services, and they are now over the age of 18. So yes, our children are vulnerable, and our elderly are vulnerable too, but a lot of our adult victims start sex trafficking or are being lured into sex trafficking when they are children, and that doesn't mean that they don't have the hope and the desire to get out of that life. So we cannot forget about that age between 18 and 25. Today is still struggling with the extreme violence that these bring to their lives. So I'm here to support this bill 100%. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. We do have a question for you. Mr. Jones?
Yes.
Thank you. As a follow-up to, so my understanding is that then we've had 202 that have been recovered for sex trafficking, and I guess that was the last year?
Correct. There are minors.
Okay, and do you know how many pimps were associated with that, or the perpetrators? Like, is it 1 to 10 or 1 to 1, or do you know that by any chance?
Actually, I do, but age and memory doesn't work together well. But with that statistics that Dr. Kennedy put together, actually, I recovered data from my own services, and we have, if I correctly remember, over 59% of the girls, they have at least 1 or more pimps involved. I don't know how many of them were persecuted, because sometimes the girls, for fear and for obvious causes, they don't want to, they cannot collaborate with law enforcement because there is no safety for them after they testify.
Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, thank you, Ms. Brown. Senator Kerr, we're going to come back up north. Ms. Cruzan, you would like to testify?
Yes, sir. My name is Sarah Cruzan. Thank you. I myself am a survivor of child sex trafficking. The indoctrination began when I was 11 years old to the age of 16, in which that's whose life I took and was sentenced to JLWOP too. In 1994, there weren't any laws to protect young people who were sexually trafficked, nor was it acknowledged, and nor was a language made available for those who represented me inside of the courthouse, as well as the judge. Now in California, there are laws that have been in place to protect individuals like myself, and I totally support this bill, and I feel that it will help many, many young people. Being a survivor of sex trafficking, it's something that will stay with you for the rest of your life. And it's not easy to be erased, regardless of me being a productive, upstanding citizen in the community today. My work that I do, I work with young people who have been sex trafficked themselves, help them reestablish themselves in the community, and build their self-worth as a person. And so, again, I thank you for really taking this situation serious, because it's a very serious issue and one that has been happening for a very long time, and a lot of people want to close their eyes to the issue. Young people don't make a decision to be trafficked, and these pimps and predators, they know how to get in and manipulate your mind and destroy any kind of beliefs about any kind of positiveness in regards to looking into the world. So anyways, I just want to say thank you, and I hope you guys can support this bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cruzan. Seeing no questions, Mr. Calloway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Chuck Calloway, representing the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. We are here today in support of AB 276. This is a very important bill. We believe it codifies in the law what we currently do. Already as an agency, our vice section is actively involved in helping victims of sex trafficking find the proper resources to get them out of that situation. 127 of the cases that Ms. Brown mentioned last year were cases from our agency. I did not pull the numbers today for cases where we prosecuted or arrested pimps, but I could certainly get that information and pass it on to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Calloway. I'd like that information, because frankly, if you're talking 200 cases with the volume that we're describing, and if Vegas is the capital of this sort of stuff, seems like we're not even making a dent in it. Your opinion is Metro successfully? I mean, do you need more laws, or are we making any kind of inroads into actually stopping or really retarding the development of this practice?
Mr. Chairman, again, Chuck Callaway for the record. I think over the last few years, with the implementation of some of the new laws that Speaker Hambrick has pushed and the Attorney General's office has been involved with, and laws such as this one before you today, I think it's given law enforcement more tools to address this situation. And in regards to the pimps, it is difficult because, as was stated, often these young victims are very reluctant to testify against the pimp or to reveal who they are. And often, if they don't get the proper resources, they end up right back with the pimp again. So it's a very frustrating situation, and every tool that we can have to address it helps.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Callaway. Seeing no further questions, ma'am, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Hansen and members of the committee. Marissa Crook, president of the UNR student group Students to Abolish Sex Slavery. Our mission is to support local and state anti-trafficking efforts, so we would like to testify in support of AB 276. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Crook. No questions? Mr. Spratley, good morning.
Morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Eric Spratley, representing the Washoe County Sheriff's Office and Nevada Sheriffs and Chiefs Association, here in support of AB 276, thanking Speaker Hambrick for bringing this forward for the victims of human trafficking throughout the state.
Thank you, Mr. Spratley. Go ahead, sir.
For the record, Mike Dyer with the Nevada Catholic Conference, putting on the record the support of the Nevada Catholic bishops and the Catholic Church for this legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Dyer. Go ahead.
Good morning, Chairman Hansen, members of the committee. Joanna Jacob, Ferrari Public Affairs, on behalf of Dignity Health, the St. Rose Dominican Hospitals. You have a letter that we've put onto Nellis of support from Katie Ryan with the Dignity Health Coalition. I just want to say we support this measure. This is a core issue for dignity and trying to help the victims as much as we can, many of whom we see in our facilities' emergency rooms. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. Ms. Cafarata.
Good morning. Elisa Cafaretta with Nevada Advocates for Planned Parenthood. Appreciate the opportunity to testify in support. We also have our testimony available on Nellis. We have in past sessions and continue to support particularly the coordination of services in healthcare, and the information that we gave you highlights the reproductive health care needs of victims of all forms of trafficking, which of course is our interest, and we are certainly willing to work with all of the state agencies to develop a plan to address all of the needs that these victims have. We just hope to clarify on the record the definition of a sexually oriented business at the end of the section where the notices are going to be required is in some ways quite broad, and while we would be certainly happy to provide these notices in our health centers and are certainly interested in helping these victims, I don't think we were intended to be in this list of sexually oriented businesses, and depending on how you read it, some of our education programs could make it so that we fall into this category. Again, we're happy to provide these notices. We just think that we might need to look at that and clarify who we really want to include in that and who we don't want to include in that section. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. I'm sorry. Ms. Seaman, do you have a question? No, you don't. Okay. Go ahead, sir.
Hello, my name is Grayson Wilt. I'm with the Nevada State Medical Association, and we also provided some written testimony in support of the bill, and our physicians are happy to provide care and support wherever possible.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkes. Is there anybody else, north or south, that would like to testify in favor of Assembly Bill 276 at this time? All right, seeing none, we'll open up to opposition. Is there anybody that is in opposition to Assembly Bill 276, north or south? Seeing none, we'll go to neutral. Anybody in the neutral position? Mr. Breslow, good morning, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much. My name is Bruce Breslow. For the record, I'm the director of the Department of Business and Industry. I'm here because there's three similar bills, a little bit different, and each one of them has something very similar for us in it, and that is sending out by first-class mail to businesses. And we support what you're trying to do here. We support your efforts 100%. But I don't want to have a bill die because of a large fiscal note. And I think $400,000 for us is a fiscal note that the bill doesn't need to have. So my suggestion is that we work with NDOT and develop a sign that can be downloaded by businesses that are required to have this. We post it on our websites. We post it on the state website. We post it on any websites you want and let the businesses download them. The other thing I'd suggest is that the Secretary of State has a portal, and they're the ones that have the record of every business license in the state. And one of the other bills says that this should be posted in every business in the state of Nevada. And there's over 330,000 of those. So, again, using the Secretary of State to send a message electronically through the portal saves all of that postage and all of the costs and the cost of having to hire someone to do this. Business and Industry is a department that is cost allocated at the director's office. So we don't have our own budget. We allocate our salaries to the 13 agencies that work with us. So we don't even have an area to put the money if you should give us this fiscal note to hire someone, because we're on a cost allocation basis. But I think you can avoid all of the costs that way. Similarly, the question was asked who's going to enforce this. And while I would love to have enforcement powers, I don't have any in Business and Industry in the director's office. I don't have any enforcement agents. And to go after civil penalties means I have to sue somebody, which means I have to use the Attorney General. And I don't even want to get into how much that may cost. So if there was an administrative fine that could be levied, I'm not sure if it's Consumer Affairs that would do that sort of thing, but rather than civil. And then one of the other bills offers that they would suspend the business license if it isn't rectified in a certain period of time. The Secretary of State can do that electronically. So I'm just trying to find a way to achieve your goals, but save you all money in the process. So that's my testimony. I don't have a language spelled out, but I will be at all three of the introductions with a similar suggestion.
Thank you, Director Breslow. I'm sure the Speaker would be strongly opposed to anything that might save money for the state. So I'm sure I speak for the Speaker. He'll be happy to work with you, and anything that could reduce fiscal costs would be greatly appreciated. Mr. Thompson has a question for you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to echo what you're saying. I mean, this is something that we really need, so we need to work on whatever we can. Was doing a little bit of research with some other states, and I'd be willing to help out in whatever way that I can, because like you say, there are a lot of downloadable options for businesses to post it and so on and so forth. So I'd be willing to offer to help out in any way that I can. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much for your testimony, Mr. Breslow. All right, at this time, seeing no further people in the neutral position, Mr. Speaker, you have any loose ends you'd like to tie up, or you want me to just close the hearing on it?
Go ahead and close the hearing. Your time is short, and I do not want to take any more.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All right, we'll close the hearing on Assembly Bill 276, and